This video is for Chapter 9, Single Case Research Design for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at methodologies that researchers use when they really want to hone in on either small numbers of participants or individual participants. We often see this more in the clinical literature, in the behavioral literature, and in the neuroscience literature, but I've also seen it in health psychology and among psychologists who do crossover research into exercise science. Single case research designs, just to give you the broad classification, are idiographic approaches, which is a fancy way of saying that you're looking at the data provided by individuals. If you're making comparisons, you're looking at comparing individuals with one another, or kind of pulling together individual instances so that you can get a sense of a pattern among those individuals. That's in contrast to the research methodologies that we've been looking at so far this semester, which are typically nomothetic, which again is a fancy way of saying you're looking at group data presented in the form of descriptive statistics such as means and standard deviations. As I mentioned already, this technique of single case designs is much more commonly seen in medicine, in clinical psychology, in neuropsych, sometimes in health and exercise science psychology as well. There are two broad categories of these research designs. The case study, which is much more commonly seen in medicine and clinical psychology, or even in psychiatry, if you're talking about crossovers into the topics that we would more commonly see among psychology students. And then there are also single case experimental designs. I see these a little more often in neuroscience, in behavioral psychology, and occasionally in treatment designs such as ABA therapy designs, where you're attempting to really demonstrate control over a particular behavior. The case study method, there are lots of famous examples of case studies. One of them that you may be familiar with is the study of HM, or Henry Molaison, whose name was revealed after he passed away. He was a person who, because of very severe epilepsy, he had surgery, which essentially removed his ability to form any new memories. His seizures were now under control, but he was incapacitated in terms of the impact on his ability to form new memories. His case involved an intensive description of his change in cognition and memory. And what was learned from that was something insightful about, for this particular case, with this very specific kind of change in his brain, there were very specific kinds of emotional ramifications, cognitive ramifications, and behavioral ramifications. So documenting his case was informative in the medical literature, but also among cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists who were attempting to better understand processes like memory formation and also just hippocampal function. Some other kinds of case study approaches can be in the form of naturalistic observations, but they're focused on very specific individuals. Sometimes it involves pulling information about individuals from archive records, so looking at someone's documents, for example, to describe them as an individual. They may involve interviews with these individuals. They may also involve extensive psychological testing of individuals. Clinical case studies often describe specific kinds of treatments. So for example, with HM, with Henry Molaison, some of the writing about his case was specifically about the psychosurgery that he underwent, and then the consequences of that surgery. Other writing about him was still a clinical case study, but by different professionals who were more interested in his post-surgical memory functioning, and changes in his emotional state. Case studies, one of the big challenges with them, you're really not talking about cause and effect interpretations, because you're not dealing with high degrees of control. You're dealing with naturally occurring events in an individual's case. That means there are a whole bunch of uncontrollable variables that you don't have the ability to rule out as potential causal factors. These are often, case studies often take on this exploratory role as a result. What people wrote about with respect to a person like Henry Mollison was that with this particular kind of change in the brain induced by psychosurgery, what were the impacts? And that spawned a whole bunch of new questions to be asked in a more experimental manner. It also informed medical professionals who treat people with epilepsy about what their options are and what the consequences of such a surgical procedure might be. And that's why we describe these case approaches as often being exploratory, because they do help us to refine our questions or even come up with brand new questions that we didn't have before. Another famous example of an early neurology, or what we would now talk about as neuroscience, case study was the case of Phineas Gage, who experienced a rather dramatic and horrific brain injury with a metal spike going through his eye and brain, and the resulting changes in his cognitive state, his emotional state, because he did sustain frontal lobe damage. He had, a fundamental change in personality, and especially impulse control. So there were a lot written about him, both, at the time of his injury and recovery, but also far later than that in terms of culling the records. So what happens in cases like this, both with the case of HM and Phineas Gage, is, as I mentioned already, it's a really rich source of possible new hypotheses and new questions for researchers to ask. And also, just if you're looking at it from a medical standpoint, it's the possibility, it encourages these folks to think about new potential treatments. So what often happens with clinical case studies, in terms of the advantages, is that it can spark the innovation of new treatments, new possible ideas. For example, it was almost by accident that certain medications were discovered for the treatment of disorders that involve psychosis. So disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which can involve psychotic symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. Those drugs were initially created as a tranquilizer, but it was discovered fairly circuitously that these drugs also tended to reduce symptoms such as delusions and hallucinations in people who were psychotic. So sometimes case studies can prompt those kinds of innovations, which then can be explored experimentally or through further case studies. Another advantage of the case method is that if you have these rare events, such as Phineas Gage taking a railroad spike through the head and then surviving, you can document those rare events. Or like the case of HM, who his seizures were generated through a particular part of the brain that we now know is associated with memory. It's a rare event that you would have that ability to study him before and after the change in his brain. Another advantage is by looking at case studies and, hopefully, after, if you see a series of cases that have similar elements, it can allow researchers to challenge what used to be really, strongly held theoretical assumptions. And that has been known to occur in the past. You can also generate at least temporary support for theories. Freud was very fond of the clinical case study. He tended to write about a lot of cases that were clients that he had, patients that he had in his clinical practice, and he used those case studies to support his theoretical ideas. Now, you can criticize that because he tended to take those explanations a fair bit further than was warranted. And that's, obviously one of the disadvantages. You can also use case studies, and again, your authors are big proponents of the multi-method approach. Case studies can be powerful, often qualitative complements to group-based research. So for example, if you take a field such as neuroscience or even in exercise science, and you've demonstrated using both animal and human models a group effect, case studies can, either before or after the documentation in those nomothetic studies, you can use them to provide a rich picture of an individual application of those findings. Now, there are lots of disadvantages. I mentioned Freud. This image is of Bertha Pappenheim, who was made famous through pseudonym in Freud's writings. Hers was a case that Freud wrote about, and I think it's demonstrative of the problems with the case study approach. One of the most profound problems is that you can't draw cause and effect conclusions because there is limited to no internal validity in case studies. You are really only looking at a single case with no control for the potential influence of extraneous variables. It's also possible when you're looking at case studies, especially in the clinical literature, for Freud, for example, his interactions with Bertha Pappenheim would be considered by modern standards to be unethical. He tended to be kind of enmeshed with his patients, especially the ones he was writing about. So that raises the potential for observer bias, as well as biases in what he included in his records. And that's been found in other kinds of case studies, where the observer is often a single observer recording events as that single observer sees them. And that raises some questions about the capacity of that one observer to be objective and to be complete in the record that they're recording. What that leaves you with is the problem that is essential to all case study approaches. You really have to stop yourself from making generalizations from single individuals without some kind of extensive further study of the potentials that arise out of what you see in a single case. So for example, while we have stories like Phineas Gage, it was not really documented fully until you had experimental testing what the potential was for behavioral, cognitive changes, emotional changes after a frontal lobe assault. That required decades of testing in animal models and also in human models to really have some kind of better understanding in a general sense of what that kind of brain damage might cause. Now, some things to keep in mind with the case study method. All methods have pros and cons, so you need to keep those in mind. And with the advocacy of the multi-method approach, you should keep in mind these points as if you're considering using a case study method. So first, when we're tempted to look at anecdotal evidence you've probably been exposed to things like testimonials for products online. They certainly pop up in my Facebook feed far more often than I would like because, in my role as a social psychologist and also someone who teaches research methods, they end up being examples in my teaching. So I end up reading far too many of them. But you should remember that anecdotal evidence and case studies they're not purely anecdotal from a non-objective standpoint, but even the best researcher, when you're describing a case, you are describing an anecdote. So you have to be very careful to not take your case study any further than is warranted, which is it is descriptive data. It is not experimental data. Therefore, you cannot make cause and effect statements. So evidence of this kind is often described as not being scientific. Now, I wouldn't go quite as far as declaring all case study evidence to be non-scientific. I would describe it instead as being descriptive evidence, not experimental evidence. You also need to keep in mind that research reports, when they strictly show up in the popular press, in the popular media, internet media, however you find out, ideas like this, they're typically not based on science. They're typically pure anecdotal reports. I was listening to the radio this weekend, and I heard this bizarre historical story, and I'm going to have to do some more research to look into it. I don't know how many of you have ever heard that MSG, which is a monosodium glutamate, it's a food additive. I don't know how many of you have heard that this is something that causes headaches and brain fog and all kinds of stuff. I remember hearing that through the 1980s as quote unquote, as racially insensitive as this is, it was often referred to in the press as Chinese restaurant syndrome, because as the press reports went, this was a food additive often used in Asian restaurants in the United States to enhance flavor. And it was based on anecdotal reports that hit the media and then took on a life of their own. And there's no scientific evidence that MSGs are harmful to people. So you have to keep in mind that popular media reports that are based on anecdotes are often just very uncritically accepted and have not been scientifically tested. So what you should do is, after you read a report like that, if it's interesting to you, then you go to the actual medical literature and you look it up and see if that's something that's actually been published in peer-reviewed medical journals or in peer-reviewed psychological journals to show that that's the case. Another example for you, it's often kind of tossed around in the social media, but also just on internet archives and even a handful of textbooks that I've seen, that people with multiple personalities or dissociative identity disorder, as it's called, that you can have one personality in the same person who's diabetic and another personality who's not, or one personality that's nearsighted and a second personality that's farsighted. Well, when you actually look at the clinical literature, I can find no report in a peer-reviewed journal, either in medicine, psychiatry, or psychology, that documents that being found. The only places that you find it are in anecdotal reports of cases, not even reported by medical or psychiatric professionals. So be careful about reports in the popular press and the media, because they're not necessarily based on any kind of science, let alone good science. We're vulnerable to these anecdotal reports often because we really want to think that there's some kind of good solution for the problems that we face. And I often think about parents of children with severe autism who are often preyed upon by people who tout treatments that have no testing behind them. and that are essentially kind of peddling to a very vulnerable population some potential treatment that is based almost entirely on testimonials, some of which are fraudulently produced. So be wary of supposed case study evidence that is really just testimonials that you really can't rely on. Again, you have to pull your critical thinking hat firmly onto your skull and go to the actual medical literature to find out whether in carefully controlled conditions these supposed treatments have ever been subjected to scrutiny and whether or not they've been proven to be effective. A better approach, just in terms of their reliability and your ability to draw some more powerful conclusions, is to do what are called single case experiments. And that's what we'll be turning to next. Single case experimental designs, sometimes they're called small n, meaning a small number of participants, small n experimental designs. And what's often involved here is a methodology that was frequently used by B.F. Skinner in behavioral research. The approach is now called, and Skinner called it this himself, applied behavior analysis. Now, for those of you familiar with that phrase, applied behavior analysis, you may be familiar with it as an approach that's often used in the treatment of people with, for example, autism, to reinforce and build positive behaviors and to weaken and hopefully extinguish behaviors that are problematic. The way these small n or small single case experimental designs work is that you are able to build an experimental control by creating conditions such that you can show systematic changes in behavior with a specific controllable independent variable, often called a treatment, that you're implementing, or it's even more often called an intervention that you're implementing. So by demonstrating that you can, quote unquote, turn on the manipulation and turn it off again and show reliable changes in responding, then you're able to do in a more powerful way the art of explaining changes in behaviors. And that's something that can't be done with a case study. In single case experimental designs, researchers are able to carefully manipulate an independent variable, and that gives you the capacity for more control, i.e. more internal validity than what you could do with a standard case study. You start with making baseline observations. So, essentially, let's say that you're taking a child with autism that is nonverbal. So what you would be recording at baseline is the type of utterances that the child makes, which may be sounds, but the sounds have no linguistic meaning. So you make those baseline recordings, then you can institute a change in the independent variable, which is, for example, reinforcing utterances that become more and more speech-like over time, and demonstrating that those increase over time. But you have to start with a baseline that establishes what is the behavior like at the start without any manipulation of the independent variable. So then you record the behavior after the intervention or treatment is applied. So, if you go back to the idea of the nonverbal child, and what you're wanting to do is show that your treatment, such as the systematic application of rewards or reinforcements after making utterances that get closer and closer in approximation to language, then you look at the records. Is the amount of intelligible or language-like utterances actually increasing with the application of the intervention or the reinforcements. A little more about baseline. So the first stage in single case experiments is an observation stage where you're documenting baseline patterns of behavior. What you're going to do is carefully record pre-selected behaviors of interest. And one of the key aspects of these designs, especially in behavioral research, is you're going to pick your battles. You're going to pick a behavior of interest, and you're going to document that behavior. It's entirely possible that for a single individual participant, you may be on different occasions recording baseline data for multiple behaviors on a separate chart, and then implementing interventions sequentially or sometimes concurrently to create alterations in many behaviors simultaneously. But for the sake of argument at this point, you pick a behavior that you want to document first, and that's without treatment. That baseline record is what you're going to compare changes after the intervention to. That allows you to predict what the behavior is most likely to be like in the future if treatment is withdrawn or if treatment never occurs, for example. So in this graphic that I found, you're going to say the frequency of responses. Let's say this is verbal outbursts, and maybe that's something you want to reduce in the future. Then you can make a prediction. So you're going to project your hypothesis. What do you think is going to be the impact of adding the intervention? And then later down the road, what's the impact of taking the intervention away afterwards? So at baseline, you're recording the number of responses. So let's say it's inappropriate verbal outbursts. And then you're going to have a hypothesis. The dotted lines, you haven't recorded that yet. You're going to guess, and then you're going to make comparisons between what you actually see and what you hypothesized. So at the intervention stage, once you have a stable picture of the baseline data, so you can't just take one baseline measure. You have to measure across a series of time after a period of pre-selected time. Then you introduce the intervention, and you record the individual's behaviors in exactly the same way that you did during the baseline stage. Then you can compare the behaviors emitted during the intervention with the baseline level of performance and determine whether or not the treatment or the independent variable was effective. So for example, let's say I have an intervention for undesired outbursts in a child's behavior. I've recorded the baseline with frequencies that go from 5 to close to 10, and so I've got my baseline established, a fairly high rate of these undesirable outbursts. Then I implement my treatment at the 10-day mark, and what I see is a dramatic decrease, including some data points at 0 outbursts after I apply whatever treatment it is that is my independent variable. And what I can claim then, through statistical analysis, but also visual inspection, is that the application of the treatment, whatever it was, appears to reduce the number of undesirable outbursts on the part of the child. And that concludes part 1 of Chapter 9, Single Case Research Design.